Okay, so my last question, I guess,
Uh-huh.
is say I have thought about sex and relationships from a purity culture perspective my whole life.
Okay.
How do I shift away from that and think
Okay.
about it the correct way?
Okay. So first of all, I just want to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of people who grew up in that purity culture and
Hmm.
are asking that very question that you're asking right there. And for some people, it's even to the point of like trauma.
Yeah.
And so I think that for different individuals, they're going to need to approach it in different ways. For the people where it's like trauma, I would say you need to go talk to a counselor and get help walking through that to
Hmm.
get to a healthy space. Find a Christian counselor that can help walk you through that to get to a healthy space. Um, if you've grown up in that culture and you're just looking to have that mind shift, then I do think you can find a body of believers or a pastor where it's safe to have those discussions.
Hmm.
Because I feel like in a lot of the churches where purity culture is being taught, it's not safe to have these kind of conversations. Not just conversations against purity culture, but just conversations about sex in general.
Hmm.
Like there's no safe space for that. And it's like everybody's awkward and weird with it.
Right.
And so I would encourage you. Yeah, I know. So I would encourage you to find a body of believers where it is safe to talk about it.
Hmm.
And if you're listening and you're like, where is that? Feel free to send us a message and hey, I live in this area, and can you recommend me a church? I'd be glad to do that. Um, and so I will say that if you're listening to this and you've either left the church or even left the faith, left the Lord over this, or again, maybe you're just carrying those wounds in your heart from it, and you're still attending church, you're still following God, but there's still that hurt there. There's still, you feel like you're trapped sometimes because of it. I would first of all just say that God God sees you, God knows you, and He knows your hurt. He knows the trauma, and obviously He's not the cause of it, even though people that would claim to follow Him and that are following Him a lot of times have been the reason for that hurt. Um, and so that you can find a body of believers, again, where it's safe to discuss these things. I really believe that there's enough pockets of these. There's enough pockets of believers nowadays.
Hmm.
I wouldn't have said this probably even 5 years ago, but nowadays there's been such a pushback against the hurt and the trauma of purity culture that I believe there's enough of these bodies of believers that are gathered now that are willing to have these conversations and help people in their process of being healed, put it that way. Um, and then if you've crossed sexual lines or even lost your virginity and you feel unworthy or unashamed, then know that there's actually forgiveness, that there's actually redemption, and that the story is not over, and that God still wants to bring life into you and healing there. And man, for the person that like feels like as soon as they lost their virginity, it was over for them in regards to having a life with God or having a life in the church,
Hmm.
man, my heart breaks for you. And I would say that the Lord really does love you. There's really grace. There's really mercy. He never kicked you out. He never pushed you away, even if you felt like that was what He was going to do. And so that you can actually come back to God. You don't have to live in shame. You don't have to live apart from Him or His people. But again, I think a large key to this is not only coming back to God, but coming back to those people, to a body of Christ, to a community where you feel safe. Um, and to know that there's actually a way to be healthy in sexuality and healthy just regardless of our past, healthy emotionally, healthy mentally. I've seen a lot of individuals that were victims of purity culture begin to deconstruct their faith because they feel so unhealthy.
Hmm.
And and I would kind of call you back and say, you don't have to tear it all down just because of the hurt of purity culture. That an intimate relationship with Jesus is still on the table. It's still there. It's still available. He longs for it more than you could ever imagine or dream. And that you can be fully known without shame, right? Like, I think that's one of the biggest components of all of this. I can be fully known without shame. And I will say this, there's other individuals who've gone in a completely different direction. Again, they discovered sex. They were told, don't do it. And they were told to, they began to experience sex and freedom of sexuality. And now they're conflicted over, well, what do I do about this?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing. Like, you kind of find that body of believers you can talk to about this. And don't just find social media echo chambers with hurt, because all that usually doesn't help resolve the hurt, even though it may feel better to get it out. But you can have that, but then you can also take that next step of, well, what does it look like for me to actually get healed? And not just vent. And so, I guess those would be the kind of the things so the most practical thing I can say is just know that their shame doesn't have to be the cloud over you, and that you don't have to hide the fact that you had sex before marriage, and that you can be part of a body of Christ where you're accepted and you're loved, and people can walk you through this, and that and I'll say this too, not every church has a purity culture.